The letter arrived 12 years before he did, creased and water-stained, smelling of pine resin and distant fires. And on the outside of the envelope, someone had written the name Dexter Shepard in a hand so careful it looked like a man who had practiced writing it 100 times before committing it to paper. Nora Covington was 17 years old when she first read that name, and she was 29 when she watched the man himself ride into the dusty stretch of Cimarron, New Mexico territory, on a bay horse that looked like it had covered half the continent to get there. She was standing on the porch of the general store she had run alone for the past 3 years, her dark hair pinned up beneath a sun-bleached hat, her hands rough from hard work, and her heart doing something she had not given it permission to do in a very long time. She told herself it was only surprise. She told herself the quickening in her chest was nothing more than the strangeness of seeing a ghost made flesh, because that was exactly what Dexter Shepard had been to her for over a decade. A ghost, a name on a letter. A story her older brother Owen had told her about his best friend from the cattle drives along the Goodnight-loving trail, the man who had once pulled Owen from a flooded river crossing and never thought twice about it. The man who had written once, promised to come through Cimarron eventually, and then disappeared from all of their lives like smoke on a hard wind. Owen had died of fever in the winter of 1879. He was 26 years old and Nora had been 22, and she had buried him herself in the frozen ground behind the little church at the edge of town because there was no one else to do it. She had kept the letter. She did not know why exactly. Perhaps because it was the last thing Owen had shown her with any real excitement in his eyes. Perhaps because a girl of 17 who had never been anywhere could not help but fall a little in love with a name that came attached to a story about reckless bravery and a swollen river, and a man who did not stop to calculate the odds before jumping in after someone he cared about. The year was 1882 when Dexter Shepard rode into Cimarron, and the New Mexico territory was a hard and beautiful and dangerous place. The Lincoln County War had settled into an uneasy quiet, but the tensions between cattle barons and smaller ranchers still crackled in the air like lightning before a storm. The railroad had not yet come to Cimarron directly, though the talk of it was everywhere, and the town itself was a collection of adobe and timber buildings baking under the high desert sun, surrounded by the rolling grassland and piñon-covered hills that made this corner of New Mexico territory feel like the edge of the known world. Nora had come to Cimarron with Owen when she was 19, 2 years after Owen had settled there to try his hand at ranching on a small parcel of land northeast of town. She had followed her brother because there was nothing left in Texas after their parents died within a year of each other from a bad winter sickness, and because Nora Covington had always been the kind of woman who moved toward things rather than away from them. She had taken work at the general store when the owner, an elderly German man named Mr. Hosser, needed help with the accounts, and when Mr. Hosser's eyesight failed him so badly that he could no longer read his own ledger, she had slowly taken over the running of the place until he finally signed it over to her in 1880, saying she had earned it 10 times over and he was going back east to live with his daughter. So Nora owned the store. She had a small house attached to the back of it, a good horse named Calla, 2 cats who refused to earn their keep by catching mice, and a life that was full enough on the surface that most days she did not notice the hollow place in the center of it. She was known in Cimarron as a fair and practical woman, honest with her prices, generous in extending credit to families who were having a hard season, and possessed of a dry humor that the ranchers who came in to buy supplies found refreshing in a way they could not quite articulate. She had been courted twice and had declined both times, not out of coldness but because something in her could not quite settle into the idea of those particular men, and she was not the kind of woman who would marry simply to fill a space. She had not thought about Dexter Shepard for months. That was what she told herself later, though it was not entirely true. She thought about the name sometimes at night when the desert wind came through the hills and made the house creak, when she lay in the dark and the hollow place made itself known. She thought about a boy who had jumped into a flooded river for her brother, who had written a letter full of careful sentences about the beauty of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains and his intention to find a piece of land someday where he could put down roots. She thought about a name the way you think about a song you half remember, not with longing exactly, but with a kind of quiet wondering about the person attached to it. And then there he was. He rode in on that bay horse just after the noon hour, when the sun was high and merciless, and the main street of Cimarron was nearly empty because sensible people were inside or in the shade. He was tall in the saddle, lean in the way that men get lean when they have covered a lot of ground on not enough food, with a dark hat pulled low against the glare, and a week's worth of stubble on a jaw that was strong without being hard. He had a bedroll and saddlebags and a rifle in the scabbard, and he led a second horse, a gray mule loaded with a battered trunk that had been repaired so many times with different materials that it looked like a patchwork quilt made of leather and rope and tin. He pulled up in front of the general store because it was the logical place to pull up when you arrived in a town with nothing but what you were carrying and a need to ask where things were. Nora was sweeping the porch. She saw him come to a stop and she looked up, the way you look up at any stranger riding in, with the automatic assessment of someone who had spent 3 years reading the territory's people. She registered the road-worn look of him, the quality of the horse despite its fatigue, the way he sat the saddle like a man who had been born to it. And then he pushed his hat back and she saw his face clearly and something in her chest lurched sideways in a way that made no sense at all, because she had never seen this face before. She had no reason to recognize it. She did not know it, but she said his name before she could stop herself. Dexter Shepard. He had been about to swing down from the horse. He froze, one hand on the saddle horn, and looked at her with the kind of careful attention you give to a situation you have not yet classified as safe or dangerous. "I am," he said. His voice was lower than she had imagined, steadier. "Do I know you?" "You knew my brother," Nora said, and she heard her own voice doing something complicated, getting both stronger and thinner at the same time. "Owen Covington. He talked about you. I am Nora." There was a silence then, and she watched the careful watchfulness in his face give way to something else entirely, something that moved through him like weather, like the passage of a front across open sky. He swung down from the horse slowly, keeping hold of the reins, and he stood there in the street looking at her from under the brim of that dark hat, and she could see that he was working through something, calculating something, and she thought she understood it because she was doing it too. "Owen's sister," he said. "It was not a question. He told me about you. He said you were the most stubborn person in Texas and probably the smartest too." Nora felt something unlock in her throat. "He was right about both," she said, and then without meaning to she added, "He died 3 years ago. The fever." Dexter Shepard stood very still for a moment. Then he took his hat off with one hand and held it against his chest, and she could see his face completely now, and she could see that the news cost him something real and immediate even after all the years of silence between them. His eyes were dark brown, and they were looking at her with an expression she did not have a name for yet but would spend the next several weeks trying to find words for. "I am sorry," he said simply. "I am genuinely sorry. He was one of the best men I ever knew." "He was," Nora agreed. Another silence, and then Dexter Shepard put his hat back on and glanced down the street and back at her and said, "I came here intending to find a piece of land and build something. I did not know about Owen. I did not know you were here." "Well," Nora said, and she picked up her broom again because she needed something to do with her hands, "you have found the territory. Come inside and I will tell you what land is available and who you need to talk to. Your horses look like they need water, and your mule looks like he needs to put down that trunk for a few hours." Dexter Shepard looked at her for one more moment with that unnamed expression, and then a slow smile moved across his face, and it transformed it in a way that made the hollow place in Nora's chest do something she firmly chose to ignore for the time being. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He came inside. The store smelled of dried herbs and coffee and leather, and the particular dusty sweetness of bolts of cloth. Nora moved behind the counter with practiced efficiency, putting on the coffee that was always ready on the small iron stove in the corner, pulling out a ledger in which she kept notes about available land parcels because people were always asking. Dexter tied his horses at the rail outside and came through the door and stood looking around the store with that same careful attention he had given her on the porch, as if he was cataloging everything he saw and deciding what it meant. "You run this yourself?" he asked. "I do." "Since when?" "Since 1880. Before that I helped Mr. Hosser, who owned it. He went back east." Dexter pulled out a stool at the counter and sat down with the slow, deliberate movement of a man whose body had been in a saddle for a very long time and was grateful for a change. "How long have you been in Cimarron?" 10 years, Nora said. "I came with Owen when I was 19. We came from Texas." "I know." He talked about growing up in Texas. He talked about you a great deal. Dexter accepted the coffee she set in front of him with both hands wrapped around the mug as if he needed the warmth despite the heat outside. He said you could shoot better than him and he could never decide if he was proud of that or embarrassed. "Proud," Nora said firmly. "He was always proud. He just did not like to say so directly." "No, he never did." Dexter looked down at the coffee. "We were on the good night-loving trail together in 1869. I was 20. He was 22. We drove cattle for 3 seasons, and I had not known anyone like him before or since. He had a way of making hard things seem manageable just by being there." "Yes," Nora said quietly. "He did." There was a grief between them now that was also a bond, the shared weight of someone they had both loved and lost, and it made the air between them different, closer and more honest than it had any right to be for two strangers who had met 30 minutes ago. "Tell me about the land," Dexter said, after they had sat with that grief for a moment, giving it its proper space. Nora opened the ledger. She had information about 4 parcels that she knew of, 2 to the north and east of town, 1 along the Cimarron River, and 1 farther out toward the Rio that was beautiful but remote. She described each one with the precision of someone who knew the territory intimately, who had ridden through most of it at one point or another on supply runs or simply on Calla on her afternoons off, because she needed to see the sky from somewhere higher than the main street. Dexter listened without interrupting, which she noticed. A lot of men interrupted. He asked one sharp question after each description, and the questions were good ones, practical and specific, about water rights and access, and the soil and the proximity to the cattle routes that the big outfits still used through this part of the territory. "The one on the Cimarron River sounds like what I want," he said finally. "Who holds the deed?" "A man named Garrett Pyle. He is trying to sell it because he is moving his operation south. He comes through town every Tuesday to collect mail. I can introduce you." Dexter looked at her steadily. "Why are you helping me?" he asked, not rudely but directly, with honest curiosity. Nora considered the question. "Because you were Owen's friend," she said, which was true. "And because you look like a man who actually intends to build something, and this territory needs more of those and fewer of the kind who come through looking to take something and leave." "That is a fair assessment," Dexter said. He finished the coffee and set the mug down. "I also have very little money, enough to make an offer on a small parcel, maybe enough for supplies and materials to start, not enough to make mistakes." "Then do not make any," Nora said, and there was the dry humor that everyone in Cimarron knew her for, and Dexter Shepard heard it, and his mouth curved up at one corner, and she looked away before she let herself respond to it properly. He slept that first night in the room above the livery stable that Bill Tanner, the liveryman, rented out, because the hotel was full of a party of surveyors who were in the area doing work for the railroad company. Nora knew this because Bill Tanner came to the store the next morning to tell her, in the way that people in small towns brought her information because the store was the natural center of the town's intelligence. "That stranger you were talking to," Bill said, leaning on her counter. Friend of your brother's? Yes, Nora said. Seems like a decent sort. Quiet, paid in advance. His horses are good quality even if they are tired. A man who keeps good horses is generally reliable. That is one way to judge a person, Nora said. What's his plan? Land, she said. The pile parcel maybe if Garrett will sell at a reasonable price. Bill considered this. That's good land, good water. He will have to move fast, though. There are men from the Maxwell Land Grant Company sniffing around that stretch. You know what they are like. Nora knew exactly what they were like. The Maxwell Land Grant situation was one of the defining tensions of the territory, a vast and complicated legal dispute about who actually owned enormous swathes of land in northeastern New Mexico, and the men who represented the larger interests in that dispute were not always honest about the boundaries of their claims or the methods they were willing to use to press them. Small ranchers and settlers had been pushed off land they had legitimate claim to. It was one of the injustices of the territory that people talked about in low voices and worried about openly, and that the law was slow to address because the law in New Mexico Territory in 1882 was a complicated and sometimes compromised thing. Nora went to find Dexter Shepard that afternoon. She found him at the livery, working over his horses with a currycomb, talking quietly to the bay in the way that people who are genuinely comfortable around animals always talk to them, as if the conversation is real and the horse is listening, which she believed it was. "Sit down if you can find somewhere," he said when she appeared, not looking up from the horse but aware of her immediately, which she filed away. She sat on a hay bale. "I have some news about the pile land that changes the timing," she said, and told him about the Maxwell Land Grant interest. She watched his face as she talked, and it went quiet and focused in a way that told her he was taking it seriously and already thinking about what to do with it. "So I need to move on this before Tuesday," he said. "Garrett Pyle comes to town on Tuesdays, but he lives at the ranch. It is a day's ride north. You could go to him directly. Will he resent the imposition? He wants to sell." "He will not resent a buyer with cash money showing up at his door. Ranchers in the business of selling understand urgency." Dexter stopped brushing the horse and looked at her. "You know this territory very well." "I have been here 10 years and I pay attention," Nora said simply. "I can draw you a map to Garrett's ranch if you want, or I can come with you." The offer surprised her almost as much as it seemed to surprise him. She had not planned to say it. But as soon as she had said it, she knew she meant it, and she was not the kind of woman to take back a thing she meant. "You would do that?" he asked. "Garrett is more likely to deal fairly with you if I am there. He knows me. He trusts my judgment on things." She paused. "And I could use a ride. I have not been out to that part of the territory in some time." Dexter looked at her for a moment with that steady brown gaze that she was already becoming familiar with, that quality of attention he had that made you feel both seen and measured, and not uncomfortably so, just honestly. "I would be grateful for your company," he said. They rode out the next morning at first light, when the high desert was still cool, and the mountains to the west were painted in shades of purple and rose that made Nora's heart lift the way it always did when she got out of town and could see the scale of the country properly. She rode Calla, who was a good sturdy gray mare, and Dexter rode the bay, which she had learned was named Senator, a name that Dexter said had come with the horse when he bought him from a Texas politician who had lost at cards. They talked as they rode. Nora asked about the years between Owen's departure from the cattle drives and now, and Dexter told her with the straightforward manner of someone who does not dramatize their own story but does not diminish it either. He had worked cattle through the 1870s, had done a stint as a deputy in a town in Kansas that he named briefly and moved past quickly, had spent 2 years in Colorado working for a mining operation before realizing that he hated being underground. He had come south into New Mexico Territory 3 months ago from Colorado, working his way down, picking up work where he could, and had ended up in Cimarron because Owen had talked about it in terms that made it sound like the kind of place where a man could actually build something rather than just pass through. Owen talked about it, Nora asked, glancing sideways at him. The morning light was full now, golden and clear. Often, Dexter said. Talked about the mountains and the river and the way the land felt permanent in a way that trail driving never did. He talked about you too, how you were managing the store and making something of it. He was proud of you, like you said. He paused. He would write to me sometimes. I did not always get the letters in time the way we were moving around, but I got most of them. He never told me that, Nora said. He never said he was writing to you. Would it have mattered? She thought about it honestly. Maybe not then. Maybe it would have now. She looked at the hills ahead of them, the golden grassland rolling up toward darker timber. I kept the first letter. The one he showed me, the one you sent to him. I do not know why I kept it. There was a silence, comfortable and not uncomfortable, the kind that happens between people who are settling into each other's company. What did you think of me from the letter? Dexter asked, and she could hear that he was genuinely curious, not fishing for a compliment. I thought you were someone who chose your words carefully, Nora said. The letter was very deliberate, very precise. But there was something underneath the precision that felt like it was being held in, something large. Dexter made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. Owen said the same thing once. Said I wrote like a man trying to put a river in a jar. Nora laughed. Genuinely, fully laughed, and heard her own laughter in the open air with a kind of surprise because she had not done that, not like that, in some time. That sounds exactly like something he would say. It does, Dexter agreed, and when she looked at him he was smiling too, and the smile reached his eyes, and the hollow place in her chest did that thing again that she was choosing not to examine. Garrett Pyle turned out to be a broad, weathered man in his late 50s, who was indeed not resentful of their arrival, but rather relieved by it. He had been trying to sell the river parcel for 4 months, he said, pouring them coffee at a long table in his ranch house kitchen, while his wife brought out a plate of corn bread without being asked, because that was how you received visitors in the territory. 2 of his grown sons sat at the edges of the conversation, listening with the interested silence of people who have stakes in an outcome. Nora let Dexter lead the negotiation and watched him do it with respect. He was fair and direct. He stated what he had, stated what he wanted, and did not play games with the price. He made a reasonable offer, and Garrett came back with a number slightly higher, and they found the middle within about 10 minutes and shook hands over it. And then Garrett's wife produced a bottle of whiskey, and the papers were signed on his kitchen table with Nora and the older son as witnesses. I will have my man ride to Santa Fe with the deed transfer next week, Garrett said. You will want to get on the land and be visible before then. Show you mean business. I intend to, Dexter said. Riding back toward Cimarron in the long afternoon light, Nora felt a quiet satisfaction that surprised her with its warmth. She glanced at the man beside her, this stranger who was not quite a stranger, and thought about the impossibility of the situation, about a name she had carried for 12 years like a smooth stone in a pocket, worn by handling, and now the person attached to the name was real and solid and riding next to her through the most beautiful country she knew. You are good at that, she said. Negotiating. You were fair to him. Being unfair in a deal like that makes enemies, Dexter said. I need neighbors, not enemies, especially if the Grant Company is making moves in the area. You understood the land situation quickly. You explained it clearly. Most men do not like it when I explain things. Dexter glanced at her. That says more about those men than about you. Nora looked away at the mountains. The sun was dropping toward them, and the sky above the peaks was beginning to turn amber and rose. She was not going to say what she was thinking, which was that she could not remember the last time someone had said something that simple and that accurate to her without any decoration or hesitation. Instead, she said, "You will need help getting started. There is a man in town named Cord Rivas who does carpentry and construction. He is reliable and fair, and he knows the local building methods, which matter in this climate. And there is a rancher family, the Alcades, who have been here since before the territory was American territory, and they know the land better than anyone. Getting on good terms with them would serve you well. Are they open to that? Dexter asked. Some old families in the territory have reason to be less than welcoming to newcomers. Nora nodded. That is true and fair to say. There is a long history in this territory of people coming in and taking land that was not theirs to take, and the families that have been here longest have borne the worst of that. The Alcades lost 2 parcels to the Grant Company through legal means that were not entirely honest. Mateo Alcade is a reasonable man, but he is careful. She paused. If you want, I can introduce you. I have done business with the family for years. They trust me. You are very willing to help a stranger, Dexter said. You are not quite a stranger, Nora said. You were Owen's friend, and you seem like the kind of man worth helping. How can you tell? Senator, she said simply, nodding at the bay. The horse was ambling along the trail with an easy looseness, clearly comfortable with its rider. A horse that relaxed with a man has been handled with patience. Men who are patient with horses are generally patient with people, and patient men are generally worth something. Dexter looked at Senator and then back at her with an expression that was half amusement and half something more serious. That is a generous theory. I have had 10 years to develop it, Nora said. It has not failed me yet. The weeks that followed were busy ones, and Nora told herself that the reason she found herself involved in Dexter Shepard's establishment on his new land was purely practical, purely the natural extension of her role as the central resource hub of the community. She put him together with Cord Rivas, who walked the land with Dexter and made a plan for a cabin and a small barn. She introduced him to Mateo Alcade and his wife Consolacion on a Sunday after church, at the gathering outside that served as the town's social meeting ground, and watched the 2 men talk with the careful, measured respect of people who are deciding whether to trust each other, and finding that the answer might be yes. She brought supplies out to the land twice in the first 2 weeks, practical trips that she framed to herself as business, as deliveries, which they also were. Dexter was paying for everything he bought from her store honestly and on time, which she noticed, and he worked from sunup to sundown with Cord and 2 local men Cord had recommended, and the cabin grew faster than she had expected from the ground up because Dexter Shepard worked like a man who knew what he was doing and could learn quickly what he did not know yet. But she also noticed other things. She noticed that he kept a journal, which she saw once on the makeshift table that served as his desk in the partially finished cabin, a worn leather-bound book covered in the same careful handwriting that had been on that letter 12 years ago. She noticed that he had brought a small collection of books with him in the battered, repaired trunk, real books, not just almanacs and practical manuals, but novels, and a volume of poetry that she glimpsed once when he was looking for something else. She noticed that he talked to the Alcade family in Spanish, not fluently but with genuine effort and evident respect, and that Mateo Alcade's expression shifted in response in a way that told her he recognized the difference between a man who tries and a man who does not bother. She noticed that every time she rode out to the land, Dexter was watching for her when she came into sight. Not in a way that was forward or presumptuous, but in the way of someone who keeps track of things that matter to them quietly, without making a production of it. And every time she left, he stood at the edge of the property and watched her ride away, and she could feel his eyes on her back all the way to the bend in the trail, and she did not look back because she was not ready to be the kind of woman who looked back. Not yet. On a Friday evening in the 3rd week of his arrival, when the cabin was livable if not finished, and the first frost of the season was beginning to think about showing itself in the pre-dawn temperatures, Dexter came into town at the end of the workday and stopped at the store as the sun was going down. Nora was doing her evening accounts, the best time for them because the store was closed, and the light through the west-facing window was amber and clear. He knocked on the door frame which she had left open because of the warmth. "I am not interrupting," he said. It was not quite a question. "You are not," she said. "Come in if you want coffee." He came in and made the coffee himself, having learned by now where things were kept in the store kitchen, and he brought 2 mugs and set one in front of her and sat down across the counter, and neither of them said anything for a moment, just existed in the quiet with the smell of coffee and the sound of the town settling down around them. "I found Owen's brand," Dexter said. Nora looked up from the ledger. "What?" "In the county record's office. I went there to register my own mark, and the man there let me look through the old records." He paused. "Owen had a brand registered in 1871, a running C with an arrow underneath it. Did you know that?" Nora was very still. "No," she said softly. "He never said. His land is still in the county records too, the parcel he had northeast of town. It reverted after he died because there was no heir registered, but the record is still there." Dexter looked at her carefully. "I thought you should know. I am not sure what, if anything, can be done about it now, but I thought you should know." Nora set down her pen. She looked at her coffee, and then at this man who had gone to a county records office to register his own brand and come back with something about her brother that she had not known, and the thoughtfulness of it, the quiet attention that had made him look for it and recognize it and bring it to her, hit her somewhere tender that she had been keeping very guarded. "Thank you," she said, and her voice came out smaller than she intended. "He would have wanted you to know. He would have wanted me to have the land," she said. "But I did not know to claim it." "The time for claiming has likely passed," Dexter said. "The territorial law is not generous about those windows, but I could ask around. There may be someone who knows more about the legal side." "I know someone," Nora said, coming back to herself a little. "A lawyer in Santa Fe who has helped people in the territory with land disputes before. A man named Aldous Webb. He is not inexpensive, but he is honest. Would you write to him?" "I will write tomorrow." They sat in the amber evening light, and she found herself looking at him directly for the first time without immediately looking away, studying his face with the same honest assessment she gave everything else. He had a quality of stillness that she found rare in people, the ability to simply be where he was without fidgeting or filling space unnecessarily. His hands around the coffee mug were large and marked by the recent work on the cabin, and she could see the care in them despite the roughness, the same care she had cataloged in the way he handled his horses. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. "You can ask. Why did you stop writing to Owen? After that first letter, he said you had written it, he was excited about it, and then there was nothing." Dexter was quiet for a moment. He looked at his coffee. "I started 2 more letters," he said at last. "I could not finish them. There are some periods in a man's life that he does not know how to write about while he is living them. And then time passes and the starting again feels impossible." He looked up at her. I regret it considerably." "He forgave you before he died," Nora said. "He talked about you without any resentment. He wondered sometimes where you were, but it was not with anger." She watched the relief move through him at that, real and visible. "He was a better man than I deserved," Dexter said. "He was," Nora agreed. "But you can deserve better things now. People can." The look he gave her, then, was different from any of the looks that had come before it. Warmer and more direct, and carrying something in it that made the warm amber light in the room seem brighter, which she knew was not physically possible and did not care. "Nora," he said, and the way he said her name, just her name, was something she felt in the hollow place in her chest like a key turning. "Dexter," she said back, matching his tone, and then they were both quiet, and then she said, "It is getting late. You should ride back before the dark." "I should," he said, but he did not immediately move. "Thank you for this evening. You brought me news about my brother. I offered you coffee. That is an even trade." "It is more than that," he said simply, and then he stood and put his hat on and went out, and she heard Senator's hooves on the packed dirt street, and then the sound faded into the dark, and she sat very still with the dregs of her coffee growing cold. She wrote to Aldous Webb the next morning, and she did not permit herself to think too carefully about what Dexter Shepard had meant by more than that. October came to the territory with a ferocity that reminded everyone that the high desert did not practice a gentle autumn. The days were still warm enough, but the nights dropped into temperatures that made breath visible, and the mountain peaks above the town were already showing their first snow. The aspens in the canyons had gone golden all at once, the way they always did, as if someone had given a signal, and the mornings had that particular cold, clean smell that Nora had come to love more than any season in the 10 years she had lived here. The trouble started on a Tuesday, which was the kind of timing that felt almost deliberate in its inconvenience. 3 men rode into Cimarron and went directly to the land office, and they were representing the Maxwell Land Grant Company, and they had papers that they claimed established the southern boundary of the grant, as including a stretch of land along the Cimarron River that included, among other parcels, the one that Dexter had just purchased from Garrett Pyle. Nora heard about it within an hour. In a town the size of Cimarron, information moved faster than horses. She found Dexter at the land office, standing at the counter with his own papers in hand, and the register clerk, a young man named Thomas who looked deeply uncomfortable, between him and the 3 Grant Company men, who were large and professionally expressionless in the way of men who had done this kind of thing before and had been successful at it. The leader of the 3 was a man named Cole Yarrow, and Nora knew him by reputation. He was not a violent man in the direct sense. He preferred legal pressure to physical, but he was relentless, and he had resources behind him that individual settlers almost never had. He had been instrumental in pushing several families off land in the previous 2 years. Nora walked to the counter and stood beside Dexter without saying anything, and Yarrow glanced at her with the automatic dismissiveness that some men carried like a second skin. "Miss Covington," he said, with a nod that acknowledged her presence without according her any weight. "Mr. Yarrow," she said pleasantly, "I see you are up to your usual work." "The Grant Company has legitimate claims to this stretch of land," Yarrow said, addressing this primarily to the air between himself and the register clerk. "These have been established in federal court." "Which court?" Dexter said. Yarrow looked at him. "The district court in Santa Fe. The ruling was which case number," Dexter said calmly, "and which judge, because there have been several rulings on Grant Company boundaries in the past 3 years and not all of them have been upheld on appeal." There was a small pause. Yarrow recalibrated. "Are you a lawyer?" "No," Dexter said, "but I can read a legal document and I can write to Santa Fe as well as you can." Nora put her hand on the counter beside his, not touching him, but close. "Thomas," she said to the register clerk, "what is the recorded date of Mr. Shepard's deed transfer?" Thomas, grateful for a specific question with a specific answer, consulted his records. "September 28, 1882, witnessed and recorded. And the Grant Company's claim document, when is it dated?" Thomas looked at the papers Yarrow had produced. "October 14, 1882. So Mr. Shepard's deed predates the claim by over 2 weeks, Nora said, still pleasantly. "Prior recorded deeds generally hold in territorial court, Mr. Yarrow, as you well know." Yarrow's expression did not change much, but something behind his eyes tightened. "There are circumstances in which I have written to Aldous Webb in Santa Fe," Nora said. "He is looking into the matter. I am sure he will find everything in proper order." She paused. "Aldous has a very good record in territorial disputes, as I believe you also know." The mention of Aldous Webb had an effect that she had calculated it would have. Webb was known and respected, and had argued successfully against Grant Company overreach before. Yarrow knew that moving against a property that was already under legal review by someone like Webb was a different risk calculation than moving against an isolated settler with no resources. Yarrow gathered his papers. "We will be looking into this further," he said. "You are welcome to," Dexter said, with a courtesy that was absolutely genuine and also absolutely immovable. The 3 men left. Thomas, the register clerk, let out a breath that he had apparently been holding for several minutes. Dexter turned to look at Nora, and for a moment they just looked at each other, and then Dexter said, "You mentioned Webb to them on purpose." "Of course I did. He has not actually taken the case yet. You have only written to him." "They do not know that," Nora said. And by the time Webb replies, which will be within 2 weeks if I know him, the matter will be formally in hand." Dexter looked at her with an expression that she recognized now, had seen it several times, and was beginning to understand. It was the expression of a man who is discovering something that pleases him profoundly and is taking time to properly appreciate it. "Nora Covington," he said. "Dexter Shepard," she said. "Thank you. Thank me by building something good on that land," she said briskly. "That is the best answer to the Grant Company there is." She turned and walked out of the land office, and she was almost certain she heard him laugh quietly behind her, and the sound of it followed her all the way down the street and stayed with her for the rest of the day. Webb's reply came 12 days later. He confirmed that the prior recorded deed held, that the Grant Company's claim on the specific river parcel was based on a disputed boundary interpretation that had been challenged and not yet resolved, and that he would file a formal objection on Dexter's behalf. He also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that he had found a record related to Owen Covington's original land claim, and that while the land itself had indeed reverted, there was a small question about the process by which it had done so that he intended to examine. He asked for a modest retainer and provided his Santa Fe address for a bank draft. Nora brought the letter out to the land herself, riding Calla through the sharp October morning. The cabin was finished now, a solid structure of local stone and timber with a real door and 2 windows with actual glass that had cost more than everything else put together. The small barn was framed and partially closed in. There were fence posts going in along the eastern boundary, and Dexter had acquired 3 cattle from Mateo Alcade on credit, a fair arrangement that Mateo had proposed himself after the 2 men had spent several evenings talking over the logistics of small-scale ranching in this part of the territory. Dexter was at the fence line when she rode up. He saw her coming from a distance, as he always did, and walked toward her with that long, easy stride she had been cataloging without meaning to. He wore his work clothes, practical and worn, and he had left his hat hanging on a fence post 50 feet back, and his dark hair was disarranged by the wind. She swung down from Calla and handed him the letter without preamble. He read it standing there in the field, and she watched his face go through several things as he read it, relief first, then satisfaction, then something more complicated when he got to the part about Owen's land. He looked up. "He is going to look into Owen's claim. That is what he says. I do not want to hope for too much. The law in this territory regarding lapsed claims is complicated and not always fair, but Webb is thorough. Whatever the outcome," Dexter said, "you should know that I would not have had any of this to fight for without your help. The land, the deal with Garrett, knowing about Webb, standing in that land office 2 weeks ago." He paused, and she could see him choosing his words with that carefulness she had recognized from the letter 12 years ago. "You have done more for me since I rode in than anyone has done for me in years, and I want to say it plainly because I think you are the kind of person who deserves plain things said to them directly." Nora looked at him for a moment. The wind came through the tall grass around them and moved it in slow waves. The mountains were close and clear in the cold air, every ridge and canyon visible with the sharpness of the late season. There was nothing in the world right now except this field and this man and the 12 years that had somehow become the distance between then and now. "You jumped into a flooded river for my brother," she said, "without thinking about it. Owen told me that. He said you did not even hesitate. A man does not hesitate for someone he cares about." "No," she said, "he does not." She looked at him steadily. "I have thought about that name, your name, for 12 years. Longer than most things in my life have lasted. I'm not sure what to do with that now that you are standing in front of me, and you are a real person and not a letter." Dexter was very still. The wind moved through his hair. He was watching her with that full attention, that quality of presence that she had been responding to since the first day and had been trying to rationalize into something manageable. "What would you like to do with it?" he asked, and his voice was careful and honest, and leaving the answer entirely to her. Nora took a breath of the cold October air and decided that she was 30 years old and had been practical and cautious, and guarded for long enough that she had earned the right to be a little reckless just once. She was not 17 anymore, dreaming over a letter. She was a grown woman who had built something of her own in a hard place and knew the value of honest things. "I would like to keep knowing you," she said, "properly. With the understanding that I am not a simple woman, and this territory is not a simple place, and neither of us needs to pretend otherwise." Dexter looked at her for one more long moment, and then he nodded, and the nod was as serious as a handshake over a deed. "That is what I would like too," he said. "I should also say, Nora, that I came to this territory not knowing you were here, but now that I have found you, I find that you are the most significant thing about the place." The words settled over her like a warmth that was not the sun. "That is a considerable thing to say," she managed. "I thought you deserved plain things said plainly," he said with that fractional smile. She laughed, and he laughed too, and the sound of it went out across the cold field and was swallowed up by the beautiful, indifferent land, and it was one of the finest sounds she had ever heard. November arrived, and the territory settled into the particular rhythm of late autumn, when the work slowed to its essential maintenance, and the evenings came earlier, and people gathered around fires and tables in the way that the season demanded. Dexter began coming to town not just for supplies, but in the evenings sometimes, and he would sit in Nora's kitchen at the back of the store, and they would talk for hours while the stove made the small room warm against the cold outside. They talked about everything. About the territory and its politics, about the Lincoln County War and its aftermath, about the way the railroad was changing the land even before it arrived, eating up the old cattle trail culture that had been the spine of the West for 2 decades. They talked about Owen, regularly and without sadness, as the sharp grief softened into the warmer kind, the kind that remembered well instead of only missing. They talked about themselves, slowly and honestly, the way that two people who have both learned to be careful begin to be careful together, which is different and better. Nora told him about the years of building the store, about the loneliness of it that she had mostly refused to acknowledge even to herself, about the 2 times she had been asked to marry, and the complicated mixture of relief and uncertainty she had felt when she said no. She told him about Owen's death, and how she had buried him herself in the frozen ground, and how she had gone back to work the next day because there was no one to hold the store together if she did not. Dexter told her about the years she had asked about, the ones he had written around in the letters he never finished. About a bad year in Kansas that involved the deputying he had mentioned once and moved past, during which he had been part of a situation that had gone wrong in a way that a man had died who perhaps did not need to die, and how that had stayed with him in a way that made him restless for a long time afterward. He told it without dramatizing it or using it as an excuse, just as a fact about himself that he wanted her to know because he did not want to build anything on an incomplete foundation. Nora listened to all of it. She did not offer false comfort or diminish what it meant. She said, "The man who did that and the man sitting in my kitchen are not the same man. They are connected, but they are not the same." And she said it simply, as a statement of observable fact, and watched Dexter accept it in the careful way he accepted things that mattered to him, holding them steady and close. He kissed her for the first time in the 2nd week of November, on an evening when the first real snow of the season had come down from the mountains and was dusting the main street of Cimarron in white, and the light through the store window made everything outside look like the inside of a lantern. He was leaving for the night and had his coat and hat on and was standing at the door, and she had walked him to the door as she always did, and they had stood there in that moment that had been building for weeks, the charged, specific moment of 2 people who know something is about to happen and are deciding whether to let it. He raised one hand and touched the side of her face with his fingertips, very gently, as if asking a question, and she answered it by tilting her face toward him. And then his mouth was on hers, warm and careful and completely certain. And the snow outside kept falling, and the hollow place in her chest that she had carried for so long felt, for the first time in as long as she could remember, full. When they pulled back, he kept his hand at her jaw and looked at her and said, "I am in love with you, Nora Covington. I want to say that clearly so there is no confusion about what this is." Nora looked at him steadily, her heart making a sound like the river in spring. "I love you," she said back. "I have been working toward that understanding for about 6 weeks, which is probably quick, but I suspect I had a 12-year head start." Dexter laughed, a full warm sound, and pulled her close, and she rested her head against his chest and felt him breathe and heard his heartbeat and thought that this was one of those moments that a person is given rarely in a lifetime and ought to recognize when it arrives. 12 years is not quick," he said into her hair. 12 years is the opposite of quick." "It is," she agreed. "You owe me at least 12 years of something good in return." "I intend to give you considerably more than 12, he said. December came in cold and clear and brilliant, and Mateo Alcade threw a winter gathering at his family's adobe house south of town, a tradition that the family had kept for as long as anyone could remember, opening their home to neighbors and friends at the turning of the year. The food was extraordinary, the kind that took several days to prepare and made the whole house smell of chili and masa and spiced meat, and the gathering was large and warm, and full of the mix of people that made this part of the territory what it actually was: old land-grant families and newer settlers, Anglo and Hispanic and the few Apache families who had good relations with the Cimarron community, all crowded into a house that expanded with warmth to hold all of them. Dexter stood with Nora by the fire in the main room, and she introduced him to people she had known for years, and she watched him navigate it with the patience and genuine interest that she had come to understand was simply the way he was, not performed but natural, a man who found other people worth his attention. She watched Mateo Alcade give Dexter the particular look of a man who has decided someone is trustworthy, the quiet upward nod that meant acceptance, and she felt something settle in her, some last small anxiety about how this was all going to fit together, that she had not even fully realized she was carrying. Later in the evening, when the music had started and some people were dancing, and others were gathered in corners talking in the private way of good parties, Mateo's wife Consolacion found Nora by the fire with a glass of the warm spiced cider she made every year. "He is good for you," Consolacion said, in the direct way of a woman who has been watching carefully and has decided to say what she sees. Nora glanced toward where Dexter was in conversation with one of Mateo's brothers, clearly deep into a discussion about the water rights situation along the river. "He is," she said. "And you are good for him," Consolacion said. "He came here with nothing. Now look." She gestured with her glass toward the people around them, the connections Dexter had made in 3 months, the place he was beginning to occupy in the fabric of the community. "That is because of you in part. You opened doors." "He walked through them himself," Nora said. "Yes, but knowing which doors are there and knowing they are safe to walk through, that is not nothing." Consolacion looked at her with warm, dark eyes. "Owen would be happy. I knew Owen a little. He used to buy candles from Mr. Hosser's store, and he always had a kind word. He would be happy to see this." Nora felt the familiar warmth of that grief, the good warm kind. "Yes," she said, "I think he would be." The new year arrived without fanfare, as years do in working communities where the calendar is marked more by the practical rhythms of seasons and land than by celebration. 1883 began with hard cold and a fierce wind from the north, and Nora spent the first week of January doing inventory and accounts and placing orders for the spring supplies that would arrive in February and March if the weather cooperated. The letter from Aldous Webb arrived on January 15th. She almost did not open it immediately because she was in the middle of a transaction with a rancher named Fitch, who was buying a substantial quantity of fence wire and needed her complete attention on the accounting. But Fitch left and she was alone, and she opened the letter. Webb had found something. Owen's original land claim had been improperly reverted. The territorial office had failed to follow the correct notification procedure when processing the reversion, which meant that the land, strictly speaking, had never legally left Owen's claim. And since Owen had died intestate without naming an heir, the law provided for a process by which a blood relative could petition for the estate. Nora, as Owen's only surviving sibling, had grounds. The land was still there, and it might still be hers. She sat very still for a long time after reading it. Then she got up and closed the store in the middle of the day, which she almost never did, and she rode out to Dexter's land. He was at the barn when she arrived, and he took one look at her face and came toward her quickly. "What is it? What has happened?" She held out the letter. He read it standing in the barn doorway with the winter light coming in around him, and she watched his face move through the same sequence hers had, the careful understanding, the significance of it arriving. When he was done, he looked up. "Owen's land," he said. "Webb thinks I can claim it," Nora said. "He says the process is straightforward if the petition is filed correctly. It would take a few months." "Do it," Dexter said immediately. "It will cost money for the legal work. The retainer Webb has already is not enough to cover a full petition. I have some money set aside, not much but something." "Dexter, Nora," he looked at her steadily. "That land belonged to your brother. It should belong to you. Do not make this complicated." She looked at him for a moment. "You realize that if the petition is successful, Owen's land is northeast of town, and your land is on the river, and they are in different directions." "Yes," he said. "So we would each have our own piece of land." "Yes," he said again, and then he came toward her and took her hands and looked at her directly, the whole of his attention, as it always was with her, completely present. "Nora, will you do something for me?" Her heart was doing that river and spring thing again. "That depends on what it is." "I am going to ask you to marry me," he said. "I had a different plan for how to do this, something with more preparation and probably a better moment than a cold barn in January. But you have ridden out here with news about Owen's land, and I find I cannot wait for a better moment, because there is actually no moment that would be better than this one in which you are standing here and I am standing here and we are talking about building something that lasts." Nora looked at him. 12 years of a name, 3 months of a person, the whole complicated, beautiful weight of it. "I will file the petition for Owen's land," she said. "And then yes, Dexter Shepard, I will marry you." He kissed her in the cold barn doorway while Senator made a noise of mild commentary from his stall, and the winter light poured in around them, and it was nothing like what she might have imagined at 17, and exactly what she wanted at 30. The petition was filed in February. Webb was as efficient as Nora had expected, and the territorial office proved, once the irregularity was pointed out to them in clear legal terms, to be willing to correct the process without much argument. The Grant Company, which had briefly made sounds about contesting the matter, backed away when Webb pointed out in a formal letter the chain of circumstances that made their claims substantially weaker than anyone's patience for a prolonged legal fight. Cole Yarrow sent no representative this time. Sometimes the simplest victories were the ones where the other side quietly decided the cost was not worth it. The wedding was planned for April, when the territory bloomed into its brief extraordinary spring. It would be at the church at the edge of town, the same church outside whose grounds Owen was buried, and Nora thought that was right, that it was the kind of completeness that a life needed when it could find it. She spent the winter evenings sitting with Dexter in her kitchen or by his fire at the river land, talking about what they would build. The two properties were distinct, and that was good. One was a ranch and one was a store and a house, and they decided that Nora would keep the store because it was hers, and she was good at it, and the community needed it. And Dexter would run the ranch and they would live together at the river land because it was larger, and the house he was building was the right size for a life that intended to grow. "I will still be at the store most days," Nora said, on an evening in late February when the ice on the river was breaking up and the sound of it could be heard faintly from inside. "That is not going to change." "I would not ask it to," Dexter said. He was mending a piece of harness by the fire, his hands doing the practiced work while his eyes were on her. "The store is part of you. It is one of the things I admire. You built something real." "So have you," she said. "In 4 months you have built a home and started a herd and made friends with the best family in the territory. That is not nothing. I had a great deal of help from a very capable woman." "You did," Nora agreed pleasantly, and he threw the leather at her and she caught it and they were both laughing and the fire crackled, and the ice broke up on the river, and the winter began to ease its grip on the territory. March brought mud and the first tentative green and the news from Santa Fe that the petition had been approved. Owen's land was Nora's, 43 acres northeast of town, with a small creek running through the eastern boundary, and a view of the mountains that Nora went out and stood in front of for a long time on the afternoon she received the news, letting the ownership of it settle into her. She did not plan to ranch it herself, not initially. The land would be leased to a neighboring family, the Salinas family, who were honest and good and needed more grazing room than they had. But it was hers. It was Owen's, and now it was hers, and that continuity was something she could not fully put into words but felt in every part of her. She stood on that land and said her brother's name out loud once, to the mountains and the cold, clean spring air. And then she rode back to town and opened the store and got on with the business of her life. The wedding happened on the 14th of April, 1883, on a day so perfectly clear that the sky above Cimarron looked like something that had been arranged specifically for the occasion. The aspens that grew along the creek near the church had just opened their first leaves, the palest trembling green, and someone, she suspected consolation alcade, had tied white ribbons in the branches overnight so that the whole area around the church entrance was a flutter of white and green against the blue sky. The church was full. Nora had not quite understood how many people had come to consider her a fixed point in their lives, until they were all sitting in those pews looking at her, with expressions of genuine warmth. Bill Tanner was there, and Cord Rivas, who had built the cabin, and Thomas, the register clerk who had been so uncomfortable in the land office standoff, and the Salinas family who were leasing Owen's land, and a half-dozen other families who came to the store and whose children she knew by name. Mateo and Consolation Alcade sat in the third row, and Consolation's eyes were bright, and Mateo had the expression of a man who was witnessing something he approves of, which was the best kind. Dexter was standing at the front of the church when she came in, and she thought that she had never been someone who paid much attention to how people looked in the purely aesthetic sense. She was too practical for that. But Dexter Shepard, in his good dark suit with his dark hair combed back, and his brown eyes fixed on her the moment she appeared at the church door, was the finest thing she had ever seen in her life, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. She walked to him without anyone giving her away, because there was no one to give her away, and she was doing this herself, as she had done most things, and that was how it ought to be. The preacher was a quiet, serious man named Elder Hooks, who knew both of them and kept the ceremony to its essential beauty without decoration. And when he asked Nora if she took this man, she said yes with a steadiness and a warmth that she could feel in her own voice, like something that had been waiting to be said. When Dexter said his own yes, his voice was low and absolute and reached every corner of the church. When they were married, and the church erupted in the particular joy of a small community that has witnessed something good, Nora looked at her husband and thought about a girl of 17 reading a letter, and a woman of 30 standing in a stone church in the New Mexico territory, and the 12 years between those two people, and thought that all of it, every difficult and lonely and uncertain moment of it, had been the road here, and here was worth every step. The gathering at the Alcade house afterward went on until after dark. There was food and music and dancing, and Nora danced, which she rarely did, because the occasion called for it and because Dexter asked her and she found to her own amusement that he was a capable dancer, unhurried and sure. "Where did you learn to dance?" she asked, looking up at him. "Kansas," he said. "There was a woman at a boarding house who insisted everyone learn. She said a man who could not dance was only half civilized." "She was not wrong," Nora said. "She was a formidable person," Dexter agreed. "You would have liked her." "I like most formidable people," Nora said. He pulled her a little closer. "I know," he said. "I noticed." They danced in the Alcade house with the lanterns burning warm, and the people they had come to call their own gathered all around them. And outside, the territory was coming into its spring, the grasses coming up green along the river, the snow pulling back up into the highest peaks, and everything that was going to grow growing with it. They settled into married life with the practicality of two people who had each been managing their own affairs for long enough to know how to do it and how to do it together, which required some adjustment, and also, as it turned out, considerable humor. Nora was up before dawn most days to go to the store, and Dexter was up before dawn for the ranch work, and they had both been alone long enough that the simple fact of another person's presence at the breakfast table was something they had to consciously remember to appreciate rather than take for granted, and they said so to each other when they caught themselves doing it, which became its own kind of conversation. Nora kept the store. She kept the ledgers and the accounts and the ordering and the constant remarkable work of knowing what people needed before they knew they needed it. And she did it with the same focused precision she always had, except that now there was someone who came through at midday when he was in town and stood at the counter and drank coffee and listened to her recount the morning's transactions with the interested attention of a man who finds everything about his wife genuinely worth his time. Dexter grew the cattle herd carefully, with the methodical patience that he brought to everything, and the Alcade family remained good neighbors and friends, and the river land thrived. He was out on the range most days, and sometimes Nora rode out in the late afternoon, and they would check the fence line or look at the cattle or simply ride along the river and talk, and those afternoons were some of the finest things in her life. The summer of 1883 was hot and dry in the way that high desert summers are, intense and bright and demanding. The territory was continuing its slow, complicated transformation, the railroad inching closer, the population growing, the old ways of the open range giving way to fenced land and legal claims, and a West that was more populated and more contested than the one that the previous generation had inherited. There were still difficulties. The Grant Company had not disappeared, and their boundary disputes continued, though Aldous Webb had become something of a regional expert on the matter and continued to file objections and corrections with consistent success. The range tensions between large outfits and smaller operators continued in the way that economic inequality tends to continue, quietly and corrosively, and there were conversations at the Alcade table and at Nora's store counter that acknowledged those injustices directly and without pretending they would resolve themselves. But Nora and Dexter built something on their corner of it, honest and solid, and they built it together, and that was the true substance of their days. In September, Nora understood that she was expecting a child. She told Dexter on an evening in late September, sitting on the porch of the river house they now called home, watching the sky go through its elaborate sunset performance over the mountains. She said it simply, the way she said most things, and watched his face receive it. He was quiet for a moment, and then he took her hand and held it and said nothing for another moment, and she could feel the weight and warmth of what he was feeling without him needing to make it into a speech which she appreciated more than any speech would have been. "Are you well?" he asked finally. "Entirely well," she said, "strong as a horse as I always am." "You would say that regardless," he observed. "Probably," she admitted. "But in this case it is true." He brought her hand up and pressed his mouth to it, a gesture so quiet and sincere that it bypassed all her defenses and hit her directly in the center of her chest. I am going to be the kind of father who does not know what he is doing and learns as he goes, he said. That is everyone, Nora said. No one knows what they are doing. Some of them just pretend better than others. You will be extraordinary, he said without qualification. I will be myself, she said. That will have to do. It will, he agreed, more than do. They sat on the porch until the stars came out, big and close the way they were in this part of the territory, where the air was thin and clear, and the darkness had depth, and the river made its quiet sound below the house, and the mountains were dark shapes against a sky full of light. She thought about Owen, as she often did, but on this night more acutely. She thought about what he would have made of all of it, his land in her name and his best friend in her life, this child who would be his niece or nephew existing because of a river crossing in 1869, and a letter that arrived 12 years ago, and a name she had held onto longer than she had held onto almost anything. She thought that Owen would have been insufferably pleased with himself about it. He would have acted as if he had planned the whole thing deliberately. He would have teased her about it for years. She smiled at the stars. "What are you thinking?" Dexter asked. "Owen," she said. "What about him?" "How pleased he would be," she said. "And how smug." Dexter laughed, full and warm in the cool night air. "He would absolutely take credit for it," he said. "Every bit of it." "He would deserve some of it," Nora said. "More than some." "He does," Dexter agreed seriously. "He brought us here in a way. Even from wherever he is now, he brought us here." Nora leaned her head against Dexter's shoulder. He put his arm around her, and they sat like that under the star-crowded sky of the New Mexico territory, the river below, and the mountains above, and the land that was theirs, earned and built and real, spreading out around them in every direction. The baby arrived in May of 1884, a son, born in the stone house on the river land with Consolacion Alcade serving as midwife, because she had delivered half the children in the territory, and her presence made everything calmer by virtue of her absolute unflappable competence. The birth was hard in the way that births are hard, long and demanding and requiring everything Nora had, and she had more than enough. And at the end of it she lay in the bed in the room that Dexter had spent the winter repainting and improving, and held her son, and looked at the face that was entirely new and somehow deeply familiar all at once. Dexter came in and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the child with the expression of a man who has encountered something that has reorganized his understanding of what matters, quiet and total and a little undone by it. "He is perfect," Dexter said. "He is," Nora agreed. "What do we name him?" They had talked about names. She had thought about this carefully. "Owen," she said. "Owen Dexter Shepard." She looked at her husband. "If you agree." Dexter could not speak for a moment. She watched him deal with the weight of it, the gift of it, honestly and without pretense. "Yes," he said. His voice was not entirely steady. "Yes, absolutely." He leaned down and kissed her, and then he put his hand very gently on the baby's dark head, the same tender certainty she had seen in his hand since the beginning, and the child named Owen Dexter Shepard made a small sound and squinted at the light coming through the window. Consolacion looked in from the doorway with the expression of complete satisfaction, the look of a woman who has seen a great many important moments and knows one when she is standing in it. "He has good lungs," she said. A good sign. The years that followed were the substance of a life well made. Owen grew into a sturdy, observant child with his father's stillness and his mother's precision, and the store and the ranch both prospered in the measured way of things, built on honest work and good relationships. Aldous Webb won the most significant boundary case against the Grant Company in the spring of 1885, a ruling that established a clear limit to the company's claims along the river valley, and gave dozens of smaller landholders protection they had not previously had. And Nora and Dexter were in the county seat when the ruling was announced, and they celebrated that evening with the Alcade family, in the way of people who understand that hard-won justice is worth marking properly. Cord Rivas expanded the river house in 1885, adding 2 rooms and a proper kitchen with a proper stove, because the house needed to grow, and because Nora was expecting again. The second child was a girl, arrived in the autumn of 1885 with considerably less difficulty than her brother, and a pair of lungs that consolation said outdid her brother's considerably. They named her Clara, after no one in particular, but because it suited her from the first moment, clear and bright and emphatic. Nora went back to the store 6 weeks after Clara was born, which was when she was ready, with Clara in a cradle behind the counter where Nora could see her, and Dexter came through at midday, and in the evenings to collect the children when Nora needed her hands free for the accounts. The store remained what it had always been, the quiet center of the community's daily life, the place where news came and went, and where a fair price was guaranteed, and where a family having a hard season knew they could come and not be turned away. Nora hired a young woman named Petra, recently arrived from Las Vegas, New Mexico, to help with the counter work, and Petra turned out to be excellent at the work and also at talking to customers in 3 languages, which Nora considered an invaluable qualification. In 1886, the railroad finally came close enough to mat her directly, with a station established within a reasonable distance that changed the supply routes and made the ordering of goods faster and more reliable. Nora adapted the store's operations with the same pragmatic efficiency she brought to everything, and the business grew in new directions while keeping its essential character. Dexter's cattle operation had grown steadily to the point where he had 6 full-time hands and a working arrangement with 2 neighboring smaller ranchers for a shared drive each summer, and the Alcade family were partners in that arrangement, Mateo's eldest son riding alongside Dexter's hired men with the equality of a partnership that had been built on genuine respect over years. The territory was changing. It would become a state eventually. Everyone knew it, though the when was still uncertain, and the changes it brought were mixed, as changes always are. More people meant more possibility and more pressure. The old ways of the land were giving way to something new, not worse necessarily but different, and the people who navigated that transition best were the ones who had built their foundations in honest relationships and working knowledge of the land rather than speculation or force. One evening in the late autumn of 1886, Nora sat on the porch of the river house with Owen, who was 2.5 years old and deeply interested in the stars, which he was pointing at with one small, insistent finger, and asking names for that she mostly did not know but invented freely, and Clara asleep inside, and Dexter coming out of the house with 2 mugs of coffee and sitting beside her in the way he always did, close enough that their shoulders touched. "I have been thinking," Dexter said. "A dangerous occupation," Nora said. "About the next 10 years," he said, ignoring her pleasantly. "The railroad access changes things. If we wanted to, we could expand the herd significantly and have a reliable market route that was not dependent on the drives. That requires capital. It does, some of which we have and some of which we could get through a reasonable arrangement with the bank in Santa Fe." Nora considered this. Owen pointed imperiously at a star and she said, "That one is the River Star," which was not a real name, but he accepted it with satisfaction and moved his finger to another one. "What does the land tell you?" she asked. Dexter considered. "That it can support more than we are asking of it. The grass has been managed well, the water is reliable, the stock is healthy. We have been conservative, and conservative was right for the beginning, but the beginning is over." "It is," Nora agreed. She looked out at the dark shape of the land stretching toward the mountains. The river made its sound. Owen had found a new star and was asking its name. She said, "The running star," and he repeated it solemnly. "Write to the bank," she said, "and talk to Mateo about whether he wants a share in the expansion. Do not do it without offering him the chance first." "I had already thought of that." "I know," she said. "I was saying it anyway, because you like to say it. Because it matters to say it." She looked at him. "Things that matter should be said plainly." "Someone told me that." His mouth curved. "Someone very wise. Questionable," she said, "but occasionally correct." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and Owen settled against her other side, his small warm weight of familiar gravity, and the stars over the New Mexico territory did what they had always done, what they would always do, burned clear and cold and brilliant over the land below, indifferent to human stories in the best possible way. The expansion happened and it thrived. Mateo Alcade's son Rodrigo became a partner in the operation, a formal partnership properly written and filed, and the combined enterprise was one of the more successful small ranching operations in the county by 1888. Not enormous, not a cattle baron's dream, but honest and self-sustaining and growing in the measured way of something built to last. Owen started school in Cimarron when he was 5, in 1889, in the small schoolhouse that had been built on the south end of town, with funds raised partly by Nora and partly by a collection she had organized among the families who used the store, because she believed in a schoolhouse the way she believed in a properly kept ledger, as a foundation for everything that comes after. He was a serious and curious student, and his teacher, a young woman named Miss Albright who had come from Colorado, told Nora at the end of the first month that Owen asked more questions than any student she had ever had, and she considered it an excellent quality. Clara followed her brother into the schoolhouse 2 years later, and where Owen was methodical, Clara was mercurial, brilliant and impatient, and full of opinions that she shared freely, which everyone who knew her parents found entirely predictable. In 1890, Nora discovered she was expecting a third child. She told Dexter in the kitchen of the River House on a morning in January, very directly, as she had told him everything of significance. He set down his coffee cup and looked at her. "Are you happy about it?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" "Entirely," he said, "and then the house will need another room." "Cord Rivas still does excellent work," Nora said. "I will go to him tomorrow," Dexter said. "Today would be better," Nora said. "I want the room finished before the summer." Dexter laughed and got his hat. The third child was a son, born in June of 1890, and they named him James, and he arrived with a constitution that was immediately and obviously different from either of his siblings, slower to cry and faster to smile, a gentle child who from the beginning had the quality of someone at ease in the world and intending to remain so. Consolacion Alcade, who delivered him as she had delivered the others, declared him the most cooperative baby she had ever seen, which Nora took as a mixed compliment since cooperative was not generally the descriptor applied to Shepard children. The years piled up the way good years do, full of small significant moments that make up the real fabric of a life. Owen went away to school in Santa Fe when he was 14, a decision that cost Nora something every morning for the first 3 months, and that she never regretted for a moment. Clara stayed home longer, not because she was less capable, but because she had decided at 11 that she was going to run the store when she was old enough, and had essentially begun doing so already, which Nora found both flattering and entirely in character. The territory became a state. New Mexico's path to statehood was long and complicated, and did not arrive until 1912, but the years leading to it were years of gradual formalization, of institutions becoming more solid and laws becoming more consistent, and the wild and contingent nature of the frontier giving way to something more settled. Nora and Dexter were in their late 40s by then, and they stood together in Cimarron watching the celebrations with the particular satisfaction of people who had been part of building the place that was now being formally recognized. The Covington family store, which had been in its location on the main street for over 30 years by that point, had Clara behind the counter and 2 young assistants she managed with a directness that everyone who knew Nora recognized immediately. Owen had come back from Santa Fe and was working in law, having found his way to Aldous Webb's firm through the connection that had started with a boundary dispute decades ago. And he had the quiet, focused quality of his father and the precision of his mother, and was becoming the kind of lawyer the territory actually needed. James ran a portion of the ranch, the parts that required patience and consistency, and was good at it in his easygoing, thorough way, and had married a woman named Felicidad Alcaide, Rodrigo's daughter, which pleased everyone involved enormously, and which Mateo Alcaide, now elderly but still sharp-eyed, described as the best possible outcome of a friendship he had invested in carefully over many years. Nora and Dexter were sitting on the porch on an evening in 1895, when the sky was doing its evening performance over the mountains and the river could be heard below, and the house behind them was full of the sounds of the children who came and went. Owen home for a visit with his wife, Clara's laugh from the kitchen, James's voice from somewhere in the yard. The sound of a family that had taken root and was growing in every direction. They were in their early 40s, both of them, and the years had done what years do, adding lines and weight and the particular quality of faces that have spent a great deal of time in the open and the sun and the weather. And Nora thought, looking at Dexter in the evening light, that she had never found him more beautiful than she did right now with the history of all their years visible in his face. He was looking at the mountains. His hands were on the arms of his chair, large and marked by all the work they had done. He turned his head and found her looking at him and did not say anything for a moment, just looked back. "What are you thinking?" he asked. 12 years, she said. "We have been married 12 years, he said, calculating. "No, I am thinking about the 12 years before you came," she said. "The name I kept." He was quiet. The evening light moved. "Do you regret it, keeping it?" "No," she said. "I think it was how I was keeping a space, something I was keeping open without knowing it for when you actually arrived." Dexter reached across the space between the chairs and took her hand. "I wasted a lot of years," he said, "not coming sooner." "You came when you came," Nora said. "You cannot go back and change the route, only where you end up." "And where I ended up is here," he said. "Yes," she said, "here." His hand was warm around hers. The river made its sound. The mountains went amber and rose, and then the cool blue of dusk, and the stars began to appear one by one the way they always did, the way they always would, and below them Cimarron settled into its evening, the town that she had built a life in and that had given her everything that mattered, and beside her the man who had come to the territory with nothing but a name she recognized, and she had loved that name for 12 years, and she loved the person 12 years more. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. Inside the house, the sounds of their family moved through the warm rooms, and the night came on full and clear, and the territory breathed around them, old and beautiful and permanent, and there was nothing left undone between them and nothing that needed to be said that had not been said, and the quiet between them was the best kind, the kind that only comes when two people have found their way all the way home.